On the evening of November 8, 1984, inside the gold-trimmed walls of NBC Studio 8H in Manhattan, Frank Sinatra was about to do something he would regret for the rest of his life. In front of 22 million Americans watching live, surrounded by the biggest names in entertainment, the 68-year-old legend was going to laugh at a 26-year-old Michael Jackson. He thought he was putting a pop star in his place. What he didn't know was that Michael had been carrying a letter in his inside jacket pocket for 3 years. A folded, yellowing letter that would change everything Sinatra believed about the young man standing across the stage from him. The event was called A Salute to American Music, a live televised tribute gala broadcast on NBC to raise funds for the Performing Arts Heritage Fund. It was the kind of evening where old Hollywood and new Hollywood were forced into the same room and expected to smile politely for the cameras. Bob Hope was hosting. Sammy Davis Jr. was performing. Liza Minnelli was presenting. The audience inside the studio included Henry Kissinger, Nancy Reagan, Gregory Peck, and 3 former heads of major Hollywood studios. This was not MTV. This was not the American Music Awards. This was the establishment, in full evening dress, gathered to celebrate what they considered the only music that mattered. And in 1984, no one represented that establishment more completely than Frank Sinatra. Sinatra was untouchable. He had survived 4 decades at the top of American entertainment when most careers lasted 4 years. He had sung for presidents, dined with mob bosses, married movie stars, and won an Academy Award. He spoke to senators on first-name terms. When Frank Sinatra walked into a room, conversations stopped, drinks were refilled, and the temperature seemed to shift. To the men and women in that NBC studio, Sinatra wasn't just a singer. He was the living definition of what a real musician looked like. A man who had paid his dues in smoky clubs, who could read a chart, who understood phrasing, who had earned every ounce of his legend through decades of disciplined craft. Michael Jackson, by contrast, represented everything Sinatra privately resented about the new music industry. Thriller had sold over 40 million copies that year. Michael had become the first black artist to dominate MTV, the first solo performer to win 8 Grammys in a single night, and the most recognizable face on the planet. To the public, he was a miracle. To Frank Sinatra and the old guard, he was a symptom of cultural decline, a kid with a high voice, a single sequined glove, and a moonwalk that was somehow being compared to Fred Astaire. What the audience didn't know, what almost no one in the world knew, was that Michael Jackson worshipped Frank Sinatra. He had been studying Sinatra's recordings since he was 9 years old. He could hum every phrase of In the Wee Small Hours. He had a private collection of Sinatra's live performances on reel-to-reel tape, gifted to him by Sammy Davis Jr. years earlier. And the letter in his jacket pocket that night, the one he had carried with him for 3 years across 4 world tours, was written in Frank Sinatra's own handwriting. Michael had never told anyone about the letter, not his brothers, not his manager, not even Quincy Jones. It was the most private thing he owned, and he kept it close because it was the proof of something he could barely believe himself. But on this November night, under the hot television lights, with the cameras rolling and the country watching, Frank Sinatra was about to forget that letter ever existed. He was about to lean toward the microphone, glance at the young man in the rhinestone jacket, and say the words that would echo through entertainment history for the next 40 years. And Michael Jackson, quiet and trembling in the wings, was about to make a decision that would bring the king of Hollywood to his knees. 2 hours before the cameras went live, the backstage corridors of NBC Studio 8H were a maze of velvet ropes, cigarette smoke, and barely contained ego. Producers ran past each other with clipboards. Wardrobe assistants chased after fading stars with lint rollers. Somewhere down the hall, a piano was being tuned, and inside dressing room number 3, Frank Sinatra was holding court the way only Frank Sinatra could. He sat in a leather chair with a glass of Jack Daniels in his hand, a cigarette burning in a crystal ashtray beside him, surrounded by 3 men who had been part of his inner circle since the 1960s. Sammy Davis Jr. was perched on the arm of the couch, his cufflinks catching the light. Jilly Rizzo, Sinatra's lifelong friend and unofficial bodyguard, leaned against the wall by the door, and Don Costa, the legendary arranger, sat across from Frank thumbing through a stack of sheet music. The conversation that night, according to a young production assistant named Eleanor Briggs, who would later recount the evening in a private memoir, was easy and warm until someone mentioned the running order. Michael Jackson was scheduled to perform a tribute segment just 2 slots after Sinatra's opening number. Sinatra exhaled smoke through his nose and shook his head slowly. "Who put that on the sheet?" he asked, not really expecting an answer. "We're doing a salute to American music, and they got the kid with the glove following me?" Sammy chuckled uncomfortably. Frank, come on. The kid's the biggest thing in the country right now. The kid wears one glove and thinks he's Sammy Davis, Sinatra said flatly. No offense, Sam. Sammy didn't laugh this time. He looked down at his shoes. He had met Michael Jackson when Michael was 11 years old, performing on a television special at the Sahara in Las Vegas. He had watched that small, serious child stand in the wings and study every single one of his stage movements with the focus of a surgeon. Sammy knew something about Michael that Frank refused to see. But you didn't correct Frank Sinatra in his own dressing room. Not in 1984. Not ever. Eleanor Briggs, the production assistant, knocked on the door at that moment to deliver Sinatra's final cue sheet. She was 23 years old, fresh out of NYU, and she was terrified. She handed Sinatra the paper, kept her eyes down, and turned to leave. But before she could escape, she heard Sinatra mutter behind her, "Tell the kid not to do that little dance thing during my number. I don't need a backup dancer." The men in the room laughed. Eleanor closed the door behind her and stood in the hallway with the cue sheet trembling in her hand. She walked the long way back to the production office, and that route took her past dressing room number 11, the smallest one on the floor, the one usually given to whichever performer the studio considered the least important. The door was cracked open. Eleanor slowed down, then stopped completely. Michael Jackson was sitting alone in front of the mirror. He wasn't doing vocal warm-ups. He wasn't rehearsing choreography. He was sitting perfectly still, staring at something in his hands. Eleanor watched for a moment before she realized what it was. A folded piece of paper, soft and worn at the edges, the kind of paper that had been opened and refolded 1,000 times. Michael was reading it silently, his lips moving over the words as though he had memorized every syllable years ago and was simply visiting them, again the way someone visits an old friend. Then he carefully folded the letter, kissed the paper once, and slipped it into the inside pocket of the rhinestone jacket hanging beside him. Eleanor stepped back from the door. She didn't know what she had seen, but she felt suddenly, instinctively, that something important was about to happen. She thought about the words she had just heard in Sinatra's dressing room. The mocking laughter, the dismissal. The kid wears one glove and thinks he's Sammy Davis. She wanted to warn Michael. She wanted to tell him what was waiting for him out there. But she was 23 years old and she had a job, and Frank Sinatra was Frank Sinatra. So she walked away. She would regret that decision for the rest of her life. At 9:14 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, the red light on camera 2 blinked to life, and Frank Sinatra walked onto the stage of NBC Studio 8H to a standing ovation that lasted 47 seconds. He smiled the way he had smiled for 4 decades, lifted one hand in that small, knowing wave, and stepped to the microphone like a man who had never in his life doubted he belonged there. He opened with "The best is yet to come." It was perfect. Of course it was perfect. His phrasing landed exactly where it was supposed to land. The orchestra behind him swelled at all the right moments. When he finished, the audience inside the studio rose to their feet again, and millions of Americans at home leaned a little closer to their television sets, reminded of why this man had ruled American music since before most of them were born. What was supposed to happen next was simple. Bob Hope would walk out, exchange a few rehearsed jokes with Frank, introduce the next segment, and Sinatra would graciously exit stage left. That was the plan. That was on the cue cards. That was what the producers in the control booth were expecting. But Frank Sinatra had not become Frank Sinatra by following cue cards. As Bob Hope ambled out with his golf club prop and the audience laughed, Sinatra stayed at the microphone. He held up one finger, the universal Sinatra signal that meant "I'm not done yet," and the producers in the booth went quiet. Eleanor Briggs, standing beside the stage manager with her headset on, felt her stomach drop. "Bob, before you start," Sinatra said, his voice warm and casual, the voice of a man telling a story at a dinner party, "I just want to say something to the folks at home. You know, they tell me tonight is a salute to American music. And I look at this lineup, and I see some real talent. Tony Bennett, Ella, my man Sammy over there." He gestured to the wings, and the camera caught Sammy Davis Jr., raising a glass with a tight, uncertain smile. "But then," Sinatra continued, and his voice dropped half a tone the way it always did before he delivered a punchline, "they tell me the next act is a young fella who's going to do a little dancing for us. Apparently he's very popular with the kids." A ripple of laughter moved through the audience. They knew who he meant. Everyone knew who he meant. "Now I don't want to be unkind," Sinatra said, smiling that famous half-smile, "but in my day a singer sang. He didn't need fireworks. He didn't need a glove. He didn't need to grab himself on national television." The laugh that followed was bigger this time, louder. The kind of laugh that has a sharp edge to it, the kind that lands on a target. Henry Kissinger laughed. Nancy Reagan covered her mouth politely. Gregory Peck shifted in his seat and did not laugh at all. I mean, God bless him, Sinatra added, holding up his hands in a gesture of mock peace. The kid sells records. Good for him. But let's not confuse selling records with making music. There's a difference. There used to be a difference. Anyway. The camera almost cruelly cut to the wings. Michael Jackson was standing in the shadows just off stage right, where he had been waiting to be introduced. He was wearing the rhinestone jacket. His hands were clasped lightly in front of him. And for a moment, just one moment, the entire country saw his face. He didn't flinch, he didn't look down, he didn't move at all. But something behind his eyes changed. It was not anger. It was not embarrassment. It was something quieter and harder to name. The look of a person who has just been hit by something they had been bracing for their entire life. His chest rose once, very slowly, and fell. His eyes blinked twice. The corner of his mouth lifted in the smallest, saddest version of a smile. The kind you give when you understand exactly what just happened and you have already decided not to let it break you. In the audience, Liza Minnelli reached over and squeezed Sammy Davis Jr.'s hand. Sammy was no longer smiling. His jaw was set in a way that the people closest to him recognized as fury. In the control booth, the lead producer whispered into his headset, "Jesus Christ, cut to commercial, cut to commercial." But the director, frozen by what he was witnessing, did not cut to commercial. Bob Hope, on stage, tried to recover. He laughed nervously and said something about golf. Nobody heard him. Backstage, Eleanor Briggs felt tears burning in her eyes. She thought about the letter she had seen Michael kiss 2 hours earlier. She thought about how small he had looked alone in that dressing room. And she thought, with a sick certainty, he didn't deserve that. Nobody deserves that. Then Michael Jackson took one step forward into the light, and the studio went absolutely silent. Michael Jackson walked onto that stage without music. There was no introduction, there was no playback track, there was no choreography. He simply stepped out from the wings into the white television lights. And the entire studio audience felt the air change. He was supposed to perform a dance tribute to American music. That was what the cue sheet said. The orchestra was already prepared to play the opening bars. The producers in the booth were waving frantically at the conductor to begin. But Michael walked past the dancers waiting on their marks, past the orchestra pit, and straight toward Frank Sinatra, who was still standing at the microphone with that half-smile on his face. Sinatra's smile faltered slightly. He had not expected this. Nobody had. Michael stopped about 6 feet away from him and gave a small, respectful nod, the kind of nod a son gives to a father at a family dinner. Then he turned to Bob Hope and asked very softly, almost shyly, "May I borrow the microphone, Mr. Hope?" Bob Hope, to his credit, handed it over without a word. Michael took the microphone in both hands the way you might hold a small bird. He looked out at the audience for a long moment, and then he looked down at his shoes. When he spoke, his voice was so quiet that the sound engineers had to push the levels up in real time. "Mr. Sinatra," he said. The room went absolutely still. "I want to thank you," Michael said, "for what you just said about me." A confused murmur moved through the audience. Sinatra's eyebrows lifted. He had been ready for an argument. He had been ready for tears. He had not been ready for thank you. "I want to thank you," Michael continued, "because you reminded me of something I have been trying very hard not to forget. You reminded me that I am still that little boy from Gary, Indiana, who used to sit on the floor in front of his father's record player and listen to your voice come out of the speakers. And I want to tell you something I have never told anyone in public before." He reached slowly into the inside pocket of the rhinestone jacket. He pulled out the letter. The camera zoomed in. The paper was yellowed at the edges, soft and creased the way paper gets when it has been opened and refolded 1,000 times. Michael held it up gently so the audience could see it, but he did not unfold it. "When I was 9 years old," he said, "my brothers and I were performing at a club in New York City. I was very small for my age. I was scared of almost everything. And one night a man came backstage who I had only ever seen on television. He shook my hand. He told me I had a gift. He told me that if I ever felt like the world was too big for me, I should remember that the song is bigger than the singer, and the music is bigger than the man. And then, 2 weeks later, he sent me this letter." Michael's voice cracked just slightly on the word letter. "I have carried it with me every single day for 17 years, he said. "I have taken it on every tour. I have taken it to every recording session. I have read it on nights when I did not think I could keep going. And tonight, Mr. Sinatra, I have it in my pocket, because the man who wrote it is standing right next to me." Frank Sinatra's face did something then that the cameras caught and the country would talk about for weeks afterward. His mouth opened slightly. His eyes, those famous blue eyes that had stared down presidents and mob bosses without blinking, blinked once, twice, 3 times very quickly. He took half a step backward, almost without realizing it. "You don't remember writing this letter," Michael said gently. I know you don't. You have written thousands of letters to thousands of children, but I remember. I have remembered every word of it for 17 years. He unfolded the paper slowly. The studio was so silent you could hear the rustle of it through the microphone. It says, Michael read, his voice trembling but clear. Dear Michael, keep singing. The world is going to try to tell you what kind of artist you are supposed to be. Do not listen to them. Listen to the song. The song knows. Yours truly, Francis Albert Sinatra. There was a sound in the audience that was not quite a gasp and not quite a sob. Liza Minnelli pressed her hand to her chest. Sammy Davis Jr. closed his eyes. Nancy Reagan reached for her husband's hand, who was not there, and held her own hand instead. Frank Sinatra was staring at Michael Jackson the way a man stares at a ghost. So tonight, sir, Michael said, folding the letter back up with great care and placing it over his heart. When you said that I confused selling records with making music, I wanted to remind you of what you taught me when I was 9 years old. The song is bigger than the singer. The music is bigger than the man. I do not think you were wrong tonight, Mr. Sinatra. I think you just forgot. And I am standing here in front of all these people to remind you, because you reminded me first. He turned to the audience. I am not going to dance tonight, he said. I do not think dancing is what this moment needs. I am just going to say thank you to the man who taught me how to be brave, and then I am going to sit down. He handed the microphone back to Bob Hope. He bowed to Frank Sinatra, and Frank Sinatra, the king of Hollywood, the untouchable legend, the man who had never publicly apologized to anyone in his entire life, began to cry on live television. Frank Sinatra did not move for what felt like an eternity. The camera stayed on him because nobody in the control booth had the courage to cut away. His shoulders rose once, fell once, and then he reached up and wiped his eyes with the back of his hand the way a much younger man might have done. He stepped to the microphone Bob Hope had just set back on its stand. Ladies and gentlemen, Sinatra said, and his voice was rough in a way it had not been all night. I've been in this business for 46 years, and in 46 years, I have never been more wrong about a man than I was about this young man tonight. He turned to Michael. Kid, he said, I owe you an apology. Not just for what I said tonight, for what I have been saying about you for the last 3 years to anyone who would listen. I judged you because you did not look like me. I judged you because you did not sound like me. And I forgot the one rule that I have spent my entire life trying to teach younger singers. The song is bigger than the singer. He extended his hand. Michael Jackson took it. The studio audience rose to its feet, and the applause that followed was not the polite applause of a Hollywood gala. It was the kind of applause that builds slowly and refuses to stop, the kind that comes from people who know they have just witnessed something they will tell their grandchildren about. It lasted 4 full minutes. NBC was forced to cut 3 commercials from the broadcast to accommodate it. But the moment that mattered most happened later that night, and almost nobody saw it. At 2:17 a.m., the phone rang in Michael Jackson's suite at the Helmsley Palace Hotel. Michael answered it himself. According to the longtime housekeeper who was there that night, Michael spoke quietly into the receiver for almost an hour. When he finally hung up, he sat on the edge of the bed for a long time without moving. Then he said to no one in particular, he apologized again. He didn't have to, but he did. The caller had been Frank Sinatra. 3 days later, a handwritten note arrived at Michael's home in Encino, California. It was on Sinatra's personal stationery, and it contained only one line. Dear Michael, the song is bigger than both of us. Yours truly, Francis Albert. Michael kept that note in the same inside pocket where he had carried the first letter for 17 years. He carried both letters together for the rest of his life. The unlikely friendship that followed was never publicized. There were no joint performances. There were no photo opportunities. But Eleanor Briggs, the young production assistant who had witnessed everything that night, would later confirm that Sinatra called Michael on his birthday every single year until Frank's health began to fail in the late 1990s. And Sammy Davis Jr., shortly before his death in 1990, told a close friend, the night Michael forgave Frank on live television was the night I understood what real class looks like. There is a photograph that hangs today in a private collection in California. It was taken backstage at NBC Studio 8H about 20 minutes after the broadcast ended. Frank Sinatra and Michael Jackson are standing together. Sinatra has one arm around Michael's shoulders. Michael is smiling the small, shy smile of a 9-year-old boy who has just been told he has a gift. Neither of them is looking at the camera. They are looking at each other. The lesson of that November night was never about who was the better musician. It was never about old Hollywood versus new Hollywood, or classical training versus pop stardom, or one generation against another. The lesson was simpler and harder than that. The lesson was that grace will always defeat cruelty, and that the people who change the world are almost never the ones who shout the loudest. They are the ones who carry a folded letter in their pocket for 17 years, waiting patiently for the moment they will need it. And when that moment comes, they speak softly, and the whole world listens.